Hi, my name's Mark Roach. This is Transcendent, and this is the 6th chapter from The Stranger. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting everything in shades of amber and gold as the 5 seekers followed the colorful bird that had appeared at Grandfather Samuel's window. It led them through neighborhoods that they'd never explored, down winding streets that seemed to exist in the spaces between the city's official maps, past buildings that appeared ancient one moment and startlingly modern the next. Maya clutched her riverstone, feeling its spiral ridges warm against her palm. The weight of her guitar case on her shoulder had become familiar comfort, but today it felt different, as if the instrument itself was anticipating music it had never made before. Beside her, Joe carried his journal tucked under his arm. Elena held her labyrinth token like a compass. Leo had his sketchbook at the ready, and Tariq hummed softly under his breath, his shell producing faint ocean sounds when the wind caught it just right. The bird finally came to rest on the ornate wrought iron gate that seemed to materialize from the gathering dusk. The gate was set into a high stone wall covered in ivy that was so thick it appeared to breathe in the evening breeze. Above the gate, barely visible among the twisted metal scrollwork, was the now familiar spiral symbol, worked into the ironwork, with such subtlety that it might have been mistaken for mere decoration. As they approached the gate's latch, lifted without any of them touching it, swinging open on hinges that made no sound despite their obvious age. Beyond lay a circular courtyard paved with stones arranged in the same spiral pattern they had seen, or the one they'd been seeing everywhere since the stranger's arrival. "This is it," Elena whispered. Though none of them had any doubt, the courtyard felt larger than should have been possible, given the size of the wall they had seen from the outside. Tall columns rose at regular intervals around its perimeter, which entwined with flowering vines and topped with oil lanterns and that flickered with steady flames despite the absence of any wind. The air itself seemed different here, cleaner, charged with possibility, carrying scents of old books and polished wood and something else, something that might have been the fragrance of concentrated attention itself. At the far end of the courtyard, a low stone archway led deeper into the complex. Soft voices and distant sound of footsteps echoed from within, suggesting corridors and rooms that extended far beyond what the eye could see. Other figures moved in the shadows, students, perhaps, or teachers, going about the mysterious business of a school that taught subjects that no university offered. As they walked across the spiral paved courtyard, each footstep seemed to resonate with harmonics that went beyond mere sound. Maya felt the stones vibrating through her soles, the soles of her feet, a rhythm that matched her heartbeat and seemed to sync with the breathing of her companions. By the time they reached the archway, they were walking in perfect step with each other, unconsciously synchronized. The archway itself was carved with symbols from a dozen different traditions, Celtic knots intertwined with Sanskrit characters, Egyptian hieroglyphs flowing into Islamic geometric patterns, Aboriginal dreamtime spirals merging with Nordic runes. Yet somehow, instead of creating chaos, the mix felt unified, as if all these different systems of meaning were simply facets of a single deeper truth. They passed through the arch and into a broad hall whose ceiling soared up into the shadows that seemed to have depth and substance. The walls were lined with alcoves, each illuminated by a single lamp. containing objects that seemed to represent different aspects of human consciousness. A mirror that reflected not faces but intentions, a compass whose needle pointed not north but towards truth, a black canvas that shimmered with potential, balanced scales that weighed thoughts instead of objects, a sundial that measured inner time, a spinning top that somehow remained perfectly still despite its motion. Between the alcoves, niches held framed quotations and scripts that shifted and changed as they watched. Now English, now Arabic, now Chinese, now languages that had never been spoken on earth but somehow remained comprehensible to anyone who read them with an open heart. "Welcome," said a voice from behind them. They turned to see a tall woman approaching from a side corridor. She wore simple robes, the color of twilight, and her hair, well, it was arranged in an elaborate braid that seemed to incorporate the spiral pattern that they had seen everywhere. Her face was ageless in a way that suggested not youth, but a depth of experience that had worn everything inessential, leaving only wisdom and compassion. "I am Lady Amara," she said, her voice carrying the same multi-accented quality that they had heard from the stranger's speech. "I am the keeper of doors, the one who welcomes those who have accepted the invitation to remember." She carried a leather-bound register that looked far older than any book had the right to be, its pages edged with gold leaf that seemed to glow with its own light. When she opened it, she could see the names written in dozens of different hands, some in scripts they recognized, others in alphabets that predated written history. You have come seeking knowledge," Lady America continued, "but here we understand that true knowledge is not something that can be given, only something that can be remembered. We do not teach subjects. We help students recognize what they already know but have forgotten how to access." She extended the register toward them. "Please sign your names. Not as a binding contract, but as a declaration of intention. Sign only if you truly intend to learn, regardless of what learning might cost you in terms of comfortable illusions." Maya was the first to step forward as she took the pen, which felt warm in her hand and seemed to know exactly how much ink to provide. She felt a moment of vertigo, as if standing on the edge of a cliff that overlooked not empty space, but infinite possibility. She wrote her name carefully, and as she finished the final letter, Lady Amara added a notation in script so flowing that it might have been music made visible. "Seeker of trust." Joe signed next, his barista's hand steady as he formed the letters. Lady Amara wrote besides his name, "Seeker of presence." Elena's signature was precise, scientific, but as she wrote, she felt her usual skepticism dissolving into something warmer. "Seeker of memory," Lady Amara noted. Leo's name floated across the page like a brushstroke and received the designation Seeker of vision. Tariq signed with a flourish that made the others smile, earning the title Seeker of laughter. Lady Amara closed the register with satisfaction. "Now," she said, "let us begin your first lesson. Follow me to the Hall of Portraits, where you will meet some of your predecessors." She led them down a corridor whose walls were painted deep indigo and decorated with constellations that seemed to move slowly across the surface, as if they were walking through space itself rather than a simple hallway. The floor was made of stones that had been worn smooth by countless feet, each one carved with a single word in a different language, words like courage and compassion and clarity that seemed to grow faintly as they stepped onto them. The Hall of Portraits. Well, the corridor opened into a vast room with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadows above. Each inch of wall space was covered with portraits, hundreds of them, painted in styles that ranged from classic realism to abstract expressionism, from ancient frescoes to modern digital art. Each frame was different, crafted from materials that reflected the subject's journey: driftwood and shells for some, twisted metal and glass for others, living wood that still sprouted leaves and flowers. But it wasn't the variety of portraits that took their breath away, it was the sense of life that emanated from them. These weren't static images, but windows into living consciousness. As they watched, some of the painted figures seemed to shift positions slightly, turning their heads, even meet with their eyes with direct recognition. Each portrait, Lady Amira explained, moving to the center of the room, represents a student who has passed through this school and integrated its teaching into their life in the outer world. They are your spiritual ancestors, your elder siblings in the work of awakening. Study them carefully and let yourself be drawn to whichever one calls your current state of development. Maya felt herself pulled toward a portrait in the middle tier, a young woman about her own age with silver hair that seemed to move in an unfelt breeze. She held a guitar, but her eyes were closed and her head was tilted back as if something, like she was listening to music that came from somewhere beyond the physical instrument. As Maya watched, she began to hear faint harmonies in the ground, actually in the air around her. Melodies that seemed to emerge from the very stones of the building. The painted woman opened her eyes and looked directly at Maya. Music, she said in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Music is not the sound made audible, but silence made meaningful. Learn to play the spaces in between the notes, and you will discover that the deepest songs are felt rather than heard. Elena found herself standing before a portrait of a woman in a laboratory coat, surrounded by equipment that looked both ancient and futuristic. The painted scientist was holding up a glass sphere that contained what appeared to be a miniature galaxy, stars swirling in patterns that followed mathematical laws, but also seemed to pulse with emotional resonance. Research, the figure told Elena, is not the accumulation of facts, but the cultivation of wonder. Ask questions, not to get answers, but to deepen the mystery. The most important discoveries cannot be measured, only experienced. Leo was drawn to a portrait of a man standing before an enormous canvas that seemed to contain entire worlds. Not painted representations of landscapes, but actual three-dimensional spaces that extended infinitely into the frame. The artist held a brush that trailed not paint, but light itself. And as he worked, new realities bloomed into existence with each stroke. Creation, the painted figure said to Leo, is not the making of something from nothing, but the allowing of something that already exists in potential to become manifest in form. You are not creating art, you are discovering the art that wants to be born through you. Tariq stood before a portrait that made him laugh out loud, a figure whose face was frozen in the middle of such genuine, joyful laughter that it was impossible not to smile in response. But as he looked closer, he could see tears in the painted eyes, and he understood that this laughter came not from avoiding pain, but from embracing it so completely that it transformed into joy. Humor, the laughing figure told him, is not the denial of suffering, but its alchemical transformation. The deepest comedy comes from the recognition that existence itself is simultaneously tragic and hilarious, and that this paradox is the most beautiful joke of all. Joe found himself before a portrait of a man holding a simple ceramic cup, but the cup seemed to contain not liquid but light itself, warm, golden, radiance that spilled over edges, that even spilled into and filled the painted space with comfort and nourishment. The man's eyes held the same quality of attention that Joe was learning to bring to his coffee preparation, but magnified 1,000-fold. Service, the painted figure said, is not the performance of task, but the offering of presence. Every cup you pour, every interaction you facilitate, every moment of genuine attention you provide is a small ceremony that connects the earthly with the divine. They stood in the hall of portraits for what felt like hours, each lost in dialogue with their chosen guides. Other students moved through the space around them, some with their own age, others who seemed impossibly old or impossibly young, all radiating the same quality of awakened attention that they were beginning to recognize as the hallmark of those who truly remembered the path and embraced the path of remembering. "Come," Lady Amara said eventually through her voice, though her voice seemed to emerge from their own inner knowing rather than from some external sound. "It is time for the next phase of your education." The classroom of mirrors. She led them into a circular room whose walls, floor, and domed ceiling were covered entirely in mirrors. Not ordinarily reflective surfaces, but mirrors that seemed to have depth and dimensionality as if each one opened into a different aspect of reality. At the corner of the room stood a small, raised platform just large enough for one person. "Here," Lady Amara said, "you will encounter not just your external appearance, but the full spectrum of your inner landscape. Each of you will stand on the platform and observe what the mirrors reveal. Your task is not to judge what you see, but to witness it with compassion and to choose consciously what aspects of yourself you wish to cultivate." Maya stepped onto the platform first, her heart racing with nervous anticipation. Immediately, the mirrors around her filled with hundreds of different versions of herself. Some laughing, some crying, some frozen with stage fright, and some radiant with confidence. Some playing music that moved crowds to tears, others struggling with instruments that would not produce the sounds that she imagined. But one reflection caught her attention and held it. In this mirror, she saw herself as she feared she truly was, hesitant, uncertain, playing small melodies to small audiences while grand symphonies remained trapped inside her, too afraid to emerge into the light. This version of herself looked directly back at her with eyes full of accusation. "Why do you hold back? Why do you choose safety over truth?" Maya felt her throat tighten with familiar panic, but then she heard Lady Amara's voice. "Name what you see without judgment. Acknowledge it as it's part of your totality. Then choose whether it serves your highest development." "Fear," Maya said aloud. Her voice is surprisingly steady. "I see fear of being truly heard, fear of the responsibility that comes without having a voice that can touch people's hearts." As she spoke the words, the reflection in the mirror began to change. The fearful vision of herself didn't disappear, but it was joined by other versions. Maya as a child, singing without self-consciousness. Maya as an old woman, sharing songs that had grown rich with decades of experience. Maya as she was right now, standing on the platform and choosing courage despite her fear. "I chose to transform fear into fuel," she said, and felt something shift inside her chest, as if a door that had been locked for years had suddenly opened. Elena stepped into the platform next, immediately confronted by mirrors, showing her various states of intellectual uncertainty and confusion. In some reflections, she appeared rigid with the need to be right, surrounded by data and theories that served as walls against uncertainty. In others, she was lost in a maze of questions that led nowhere, paralyzed by the recognition that the more she learned, the less she actually knew. But the reflection that drew her attention showed her as a child, lying on her back in a field, staring up at stars with pure wonder before she had learned to categorize and analyze, when the universe was still pure mystery and infinite possibility. I see the part of me that forgot how to wonder, she said, her scientist precision serving her now in a different way. The part that confused knowing facts with understanding truth. As she spoke, she felt her usual mental defenses relaxing, making space for a different kind of intelligence, one that could hold questions without needing immediate answers, that could navigate uncertainty with curiosity rather than anxiety. Leo's experience on the platform was almost overwhelming in its intensity. The mirrors showed him not just different versions of himself, but different worlds that existed within his artistic imagination. Entire universes of color and form that he had glimpsed but never dared to fully explore. In some mirrors, he was painting with light itself, sculpting with pure energy, creating artworks that transformed everyone who viewed them. In others, he was trapped by conventional expectations, producing work that was technically competent but spiritually empty. The reflection that stopped him showed him standing before a blank canvas, paralyzed by the infinite possibilities. It represented, well, he said, I see part of me that's afraid of ruining the perfect potential with imperfect execution. He said, this understanding that was flooding through him. The part that would rather preserve the dream than risk the reality. As he spoke, he felt his creative energy, which had been dammed up by perfectionism and fear of judgment. He saw that begin to flow again, and he knew that his art would never quite be the same. Tariq's mirrors revealed the complex relationship between his public humor and his private pain. He saw versions of himself using comedy as a shield, deflecting genuine connection with practiced routines. But he also saw the vision of himself that could use humor as a bridge, helping others find lightness in their darkest moments, transforming shared laughter into shared healing. He said, I see part of me that hides behind the jokes. He said, his usual quick wit replaced by quiet honesty. And I choose to let humor serve love instead of fear. Joe's reflection showed him the difference between mechanical service, going through the motions of taking orders and filling requests, and sacred service, where every interaction became an opportunity to offer presence and care. He saw himself as he had been, efficient but disconnected, and as he could become, bringing full attention to each person he served. I see the part of me that forgot that serving coffee is serving souls. He said this and felt his understanding of his work transformed completely. When all five had completed their time on the platform, Lady Amara gathered them in a circle, and at the center of the mirrored room, she said, what you have seen are not separate selves competing for dominance, but aspects of one consciousness learning to work together harmoniously. Integration is not about eliminating the parts of yourself you dislike, but about bringing them into conscious relationship with your highest aspirations. The Library of Whispers. Their next destination was a library that defied all architectural logic. The room seemed to extend infinitely in all directions, with shelves that curved up and around and through dimensions that shouldn't have existed. Books of every size, age, and description lined the walls, some bound in leather, some that looked ancient beyond measure, others that seemed to be made of crystallized light, still others that appeared to be composed entirely of pressed flowers or woven wind or solidified music. But the most remarkable thing about the library was not its impossible geometry or its exotic collection. It was the constant murmur of voices that filled the air. Whispered fragments of wisdom drifted through the space like invisible butterflies. Observe your thoughts as passing clouds. Compassion is the mirror in which we see our true face. Every ending is a doorway to a new beginning. The heart that breaks open can contain the whole world. The books here, Lady Amara explained, are not static repositories of information. They're living conversations between consciousness and itself, constantly evolving as new readers bring their questions and insights to the dialogue. Find the volume that calls to your current understanding and let it guide you deeper into the mystery of your own development. Maya was drawn to a book bound in what appeared to be crystallized song, covers that rang with soft harmony when touched. When she opened it, the pages revealed not words, but musical notation that seemed to write itself as she watched, melodies emerging from her own unconscious understanding and arranging themselves into compositions she had never imagined, but somehow always known. Elena found herself holding a volume that contained not text, but living equations, mathematical relationships that moved and shifted on the page, showing her how consciousness itself followed patterns that could be mapped and understood, though never precisely predicted or controlled. Leo's book was a work of art in itself, each page a canvas where colors bled and blended in responses to his attention, creating visual poetry that spoke directly to his creative spirit without the mediation of words. Tariq's volume made him chuckle before he even opened it. A joke book, but one where the humor emerged from such deep understanding of the human condition that each laugh was also a moment of recognition and healing. Joe's book appeared to be a simple recollection of recipes, but as he read, he understood that it was really a manual for the sacred art of nourishment, not just physical, but emotional and spiritual sustenance that could be offered through the simplest act of service. They spent hours in the library, sometimes reading in solitary focus, sometimes sharing passages that particularly resonated, sometimes simply shifting in comfortable silence while the whispered wisdom flowed around them like a river of understanding. The workshop of intentions. As the evening deepened, Lady Amara led them to a room filled with tools and materials of every description, not just hammers and saws and paintbrushes, but implements for working with subtler substances, consciousness, intention, the raw stuff of possibility itself. Here, she said, you will create something to carry back into the outer world, not just a physical object, but a crystallization of your commitment to the path of awakening. Let your hands be guided by your deepest understanding and trust that what you create will be exactly what you need. Maya found herself drawn into a collection of tuning forks and metal bowls and began creating a small instrument that could produce harmonies she had never heard but always felt. As she worked, she understood that she was crafting not just a tool for making music, but a reminder that her voice was meant to serve harmony rather than ego, Elena worked with crystals and lenses, creating an optical device that revealed patterns that were usually invisible and made them appear in ordinary sight. A metaphor for her growing ability to see the deeper structures underlying surface phenomena. Leo painted on a canvas no larger than his palm, but somehow managed to capture an entire universe of captured it in miniature, a reminder that profound truth could be expressed in the simplest forms. Tariq shaped clay into a small figure that seemed to be laughing and crying simultaneously, a physical representation of the unity between joy and sorrow that he was learning to embrace. Joe carved a simple wooden cup from a piece of driftwood, smooth and warm to the touch, perfect for holding whatever needed to be offered with love. The fountain of integration. As their time at the school drew to its close, Lady Amira led them back to the original courtyard, where they discovered that the fountain at its center was now running with water that seemed to contain starlight. Each drop was sparkling with its own inner radiance. Place your original tokens in the water, Lady Amira instructed, along with the intentions you've clarified during your time here. Let the fountain carry away what you no longer need and strengthen what serves your highest development. One by one, they placed their objects in the flowing water: Maya's feather, Joe's stone, Elena's labyrinth, Leo's stencil, Tariq's shell. As each token touched the water, it dissolved into nothingness, not into nothingness, but into pure light that was absorbed into the stream, and it flowed outward, carrying their transformed intentions into the world. The school exists, Lady Amira said, as they watched the light-filled water flow away into channels that led back to the city beyond the walls. It exists not to separate you from the world, but to prepare you to engage with it more consciously. You're not here to escape responsibility, but to fulfill it more completely. As they prepared to leave, each carrying their newly created tools and the journal they had received at Grandfather Samuel's house, Lady Amira offered one final teaching. Remember, she said, that awakening is not a destination, but a practice. Every moment offers you a choice to be fully present or to drift back into unconsciousness. The school will always be here when you need it. But your real classroom is the world itself, and your real teachers are every person, situation, and challenge that you encounter. The iron gate opened for them as they approached, revealing the city beyond, which looked exactly the same as it had looked when they arrived, but somehow felt completely different. They walked back through the winding streets in comfortable silence, each pressing the day's experiences, each carrying within themselves seeds of transformation that would continue growing long after they had returned to their ordinary lives. By the time they reached familiar neighborhoods, they'd become something new. Not just 5 individuals who shared an unusual experience, but a continuity of practitioners united by their commitment to consciousness and their understanding that the work of awakening was both deeply personal and fundamentally collective. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to apply what they'd learned, but tonight they walked through the city as gardens of its sleeping potential, carriers of light in a world that was just beginning to remember how to see. The school in the shadows had done its work, planting seeds that would bloom in ways none of them could yet imagine, contributing to the great awakening that was already beginning to transform everything it touched.